They wore the masks of friends and neighbors by day, but by night they were the wolves of the wilderness. This is the story of a secret brotherhood written in blood and sealed with a password that chilled the soul. The history of crime in the American West is often romanticized with stories of lone outlaws standing against the world, but the reality of the Bannack gold rush was far darker and far more organized. In the shadow of the mountains, a criminal syndicate rose to power that was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. They were known as the Innocents. It was a name chosen with a twisted sense of irony, a dark joke shared among men who had long ago abandoned any claim to morality. To the outside world, they appeared to be prospectors and gamblers and saloon keepers. They were the men you drank with at the bar, and the men who shod your horses, and the men who wished you luck as you rode out of town. But beneath the surface, they were bound together by oaths of blood and a network of secrecy that rivaled the most disciplined armies. The gang was not a loose collection of thieves, but a highly structured organization with a hierarchy and a code of conduct. At the head of this snake was the sheriff, Henry Plummer, who directed the operations with the cold precision of a general. But the body of the snake was made up of over 100 men who were scattered across the territory like a cancer. They had spies in every mining camp and informants in every freight office. They knew when a miner struck gold before his own wife did. They knew the schedules of the stagecoaches better than the drivers. This network of intelligence was their greatest weapon, allowing them to strike with an accuracy that seemed supernatural to their victims. The name The Innocents served a practical purpose beyond its irony. It was a password. In the chaos of a robbery or a gunfight, amidst the smoke and the darkness, a member of the gang could identify himself to his cohorts simply by shouting the phrase, "I am innocent." It was a signal to hold fire, a way to ensure that they did not kill their own. This phrase became a terrifying refrain on the lonely roads of Montana. To hear it spoken was to know that you were in the presence of a brotherhood that knew no mercy. They had secret handshakes and specific ways of tying their neckerchiefs so that they could recognize one another in the crowded saloons of Bannack without exchanging a word. The ranks of the Innocents were filled with some of the most hardened and brutal men to ever walk the frontier. These were men who had drifted north from the gold fields of California and the battlefields of the Civil War, bringing with them a desensitization to violence that was chilling. Among them was George Ives, who was a man of striking contradictions. He was young and handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a demeanor that could be charming when he chose. He came from a good family and could read and write, which was a rarity in the camps. Yet beneath this civilized veneer lay a sociopathic indifference to human life. Ives killed with the casual ease of a man swatting a fly. He would shoot a man for his gold dust and then laugh about it over a game of cards an hour later. He was the face of the gang's arrogance, a man who believed that he was above the law because he owned the law.
Then there was Boone Helm, who was known as the Kentucky Cannibal. If George Ives was the charming face of the gang, Boone Helm was its nightmare. He was a brute of a man with a history of violence that stretched back years. He earned his gruesome nickname after surviving a winter in the mountains by eating the bodies of his companions. Helm was not just a thief, he was a predator in the truest sense. He took pleasure in the act of killing, and he often boasted of his crimes with a disturbing pride. To the people of Bannack, he was a monster, a bogeyman used to frighten children into obedience. His presence in the gang added a layer of primal fear to their reputation. It was one thing to be robbed, but it was another thing entirely to be hunted by a man who saw humans as nothing more than meat. Another prominent member was Clubfoot George Lane, who worked as a shoemaker in Bannack. His deformity made him instantly recognizable, but it also made him the perfect spy. He sat at his bench repairing boots and listening to the gossip of the town. He heard who was leaving and who was staying, and who had found a rich pocket of gold. He was the eyes and ears of the organization, feeding information up the chain of command. Men would sit in his shop and complain about the dangers of the road, never realizing that the man nodding sympathetically was the one signing their death warrants. The betrayal was total. The very people the miners trusted were the ones sharpening the knives. The operations of the Innocents were ruthless and efficient. They controlled the road between Bannack and Virginia City, turning the 80-mile stretch of sagebrush and rock into a gauntlet of death. They did not just wait for targets to appear, they hunted them. They established relay stations and lookouts on the high ridges where they could watch the movement of travelers for miles. They used mirrors to flash signals across the valleys, coordinating their attacks with military precision. When they struck, it was with overwhelming force. They would descend upon a wagon train or a lone rider like a pack of wolves, cutting off any chance of escape. The violence they inflicted was often gratuitous. They did not just want the gold, they wanted to leave no witnesses. Dead men tell no tales was the unwritten rule of the gang. They would shoot drivers off their seats and gun down passengers as they emerged from the coaches with their hands raised. They would drag the bodies into the thickets of sagebrush or toss them into ravines, leaving them for the coyotes. The road became a graveyard. It is estimated that the Innocents were responsible for over 100 murders in the span of a single year, though the true number will likely never be known. Many victims simply vanished, their bones bleaching in the sun in some forgotten gulch. The fear they instilled in the population was absolute. Everyone knew that the gang existed, but no one dared to speak its name aloud. To accuse a man of being an innocent was to invite death. A miner who spoke too freely in a saloon might be found the next morning floating face down in the creek. A merchant who refused to cooperate might find his store burned to the ground. The gang held the town of Bannack in a grip of terror that paralyzed the community. They walked the streets with impunity, flashing their gold and challenging anyone to stop them. They controlled the gambling halls and the brothels, and they took a cut of every illicit activity in the camp.
It was a criminal empire built on silence. The gang also had a sophisticated method of fencing their stolen goods. Gold dust is difficult to trace, but unique items like watches and jewelry and horses are dangerous to sell. The Innocents had a network that stretched all the way to Salt Lake City. They would pass stolen horses from one member to another, moving them hundreds of miles away before selling them to unsuspecting buyers. They melted down jewelry and mixed stolen gold dust with sand to disguise its origin. They were not just thugs, they were businessmen running a logistics operation that dealt in misery. Life inside the gang was governed by fear and greed. While they called themselves a brotherhood, there was little honor among thieves. They were held together by the charisma of Plummer and the mutual knowledge that if one fell, they would all hang. They met in secret places like Skinner's Saloon or Robber's Roost, where they could drink and divide their spoils away from prying eyes. These meetings were raucous affairs, fueled by whiskey and adrenaline. They would recount their crimes, laughing at the pleas of their victims and gambling away the fortunes they had stolen. It was a dark carnival of excess, a celebration of their power over life and death. But cracks eventually began to form in the foundation. The sheer volume of their crimes made it impossible to maintain total secrecy. Paranoia began to set in. Men like Boone Helm and George Ives were volatile and unpredictable. They drank too much and talked too loudly. Plummer tried to keep them in line, but even he could not control the primal instincts of such men. The gang began to turn on itself. Arguments over the division of loot turned into gunfights. Suspicion grew that some members might be cutting deals or holding back gold. The wolf pack was beginning to hunger, and when there were no more sheep to eat, they would eventually turn on each other. The psychological toll on the townspeople was immense. Imagine living in a place where you could trust no one. Your neighbor might be a spy, the bartender might be an assassin, the sheriff was the kingpin. It was a suffocating existence. The isolation of the Montana Territory meant there was no higher authority to appeal to. The federal government was thousands of miles away, consumed by the Civil War. The people of Bannack and Virginia City were on their own, trapped in a valley with a monster that wore a human face. This pressure cooker of fear and anger was building towards an explosion. The innocents believed they were invincible. They believed that the fear they inspired would protect them forever. They mistook the silence of the town for submission. But silence is not always consent. Sometimes it is the sound of a storm gathering. The men of Bannack and Virginia City were pushed to the brink. They were hard men themselves, survivors who had crossed a continent to find a better life. They would not be ruled by murderers forever. The brutality of the innocents was sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Every murder added another stone to the weight that would eventually crush them. The gang left a scar on the history of the West that has never fully healed. They destroyed the myth of the noble outlaw. They showed the world that the frontier was not just a place of adventure, but a place where humanity could descend into absolute darkness. They were the embodiment of chaos, the antithesis of the civilization that the settlers were trying to build. Their legacy is written in the unmarked graves along the road to Bannack and in the whispers of the wind that still blows through the ghost town today. As the winter of 1863 deepened, the gang continued their depredations, unaware that the eyes of the vigilantes were beginning to watch them from the shadows. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The password, "I am innocent," would soon be a plea for mercy that would fall on deaf ears. The reign of the innocents was a long night of terror, but the dawn was coming, and it would bring with it a rope and a reckoning. The winter of 1863 was not just a season of cold winds and deep snows, but a season of profound moral darkness in the mining camps of Montana. The fear that had paralyzed the citizens of Bannack and Virginia City for months was beginning to curdle into something more dangerous, which was rage. For too long they had watched their friends ride out of town and never return. They had seen the bodies left in the sagebrush like discarded rubbish. They had endured the mocking smiles of the road agents who drank in their saloons and danced with their wives. The realization that the law was helpless, or worse, that the law was complicit, had finally taken root. The breaking point came with the murder of Nicholas Tribalt. He was not a rich miner or a powerful politician. He was a simple young man who had been sold for the price of a mule. When his body was dragged into town, frozen and stiff, it ignited a fire that would consume the criminal empire of the innocents. The funeral of Nicholas Tribalt was the catalyst. Hundreds of miners gathered, not just to mourn, but to witness the cost of their inaction. Standing by the open grave under the gray winter sky, these men looked at one another and made a silent pact. The time for waiting was over. The time for trusting in a corrupt sheriff was over. If civilization was to survive in these mountains, it would have to be forged with iron and rope. That night, a group of 5 men met in the back of a store in Virginia City. The room was dim, lit only by a single lantern that cast long shadows against the walls. They were merchants and miners and masons. They were not violent men by nature, but the frontier had stripped away their softness. In hushed tones, they drafted an oath. It was a pledge of mutual protection and absolute secrecy. They swore to hunt down the road agents and to deliver a swift justice that required no judge and no jury. They called themselves the Vigilantes. The first test of the Vigilantes was the capture of George Ives. Ives was the handsome and sociopathic face of the gang, a man who killed with the indifference of a butcher. He was found and arrested, not by the sheriff, but by a posse of citizens. They brought him back to Nevada City, which was a small camp near Virginia City. The trial that followed was a spectacle unlike anything the territory had ever seen.
It took place outdoors in the biting cold of December. A wagon box served as the judge's bench, and the miners gathered around in a massive circle, warming their hands over bonfires. Ives stood before them, arrogant and unconcerned. He wore a fine coat and smiled at the crowd, believing that his connections to Sheriff Plummer and the gang would save him. He did not realize that the rules of the game had changed.
The trial lasted for days. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the words of the witnesses who bravely stepped forward to testify against the murderer. Ives maintained his composure, joking with his guards and scanning the crowd for his friends. He expected a rescue. He expected the fear he had instilled to silence his accusers. But the crowd did not disperse, and the rescue never came. The prosecutor was a man named Wilbur Fisk Sanders, who spoke with a thunderous conviction. He laid out the crimes of George Ives, not just as legal violations, but as sins against humanity. When the time came for the verdict, the question was put to the crowd. A sea of hands raised in favor of guilty. The arrogance finally drained from the face of George Ives. He looked around and saw not fear, but a stony determination. The execution was immediate. There were no appeals and no delays. A beam was extended from an unfinished building, and a box was placed beneath it. As the sun began to set, casting a blood-red light over the snow, George Ives was led to the gallows. He asked for time, and he asked for whiskey, but he received only the rope. As the box was kicked away and the body of the road agent swung in the cold air, a message was sent to the rest of the gang. The sheep had grown fangs. The reign of terror was not over yet, but the tide had turned. The death of Ives was the first crack in the dam, and soon the floodwaters of vengeance would wash over the territory. The vigilantes did not stop with Ives. Before he died, another member of the gang named Red Yeager had confessed. In a desperate attempt to save his own neck, Yeager spilled the secrets of the Brotherhood. He gave the vigilantes the names. He told them who the spies were and who the enforcers were and who the leaders were, and most shockingly, he confirmed what many had suspected. The head of the snake was none other than Sheriff Henry Plummer. The list of names was written down, and it became a death warrant for over 20 men. The vigilantes organized themselves into strike teams. They were disciplined and efficient, moving with the stealth of the very road agents they hunted. They rode out into the winter nights, traversing the frozen plains to catch the outlaws in their sleep. They struck in the mining camps, and they struck in the lonely cabins, and they struck in the saloons. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon. Men who had lived by the gun found themselves waking up to the cold steel of a revolver pressed against their temples. There were no more long trials. The evidence had already been heard, and the verdict had already been decided. The question was simple: were you on the list? If the answer was yes, the outcome was the rope. They hanged them from the rafters of unfinished buildings, and they hanged them from the cottonwood trees along the riverbanks, and they hanged them from the corrals. The efficiency of the vigilantes was terrifying. In a span of a few weeks, they dismantled an organization that had ruled the territory for a year. The road agents who were not caught fled in panic, riding their horses into the ground to escape the wrath of the committee. But the vigilantes were relentless. They tracked men through blizzards and across mountain ranges. They were fueled by a righteous anger that brooked no compromise. To them, this was not murder, it was sanitation. They were cleansing the land of a disease that had festered for too long. The symbol of the vigilantes became the numbers 3777. The meaning of these numbers remains a mystery to this day. Some say it referred to the dimensions of a grave, and others say it was a Masonic code. But to the outlaws, it meant only one thing: run or die. The final and most painful task for the vigilantes was dealing with Henry Plummer. He was the man they had elected, and the man they had trusted,
and the man they had invited into their homes. The betrayal felt personal. On the night of January 10th, a group of 50 vigilantes rode into Bannack. The town was quiet, and the snow muffled the sound of their horses' hooves. They moved through the streets like ghosts, surrounding the cabin where the sheriff lived. Plummer was found resting on a couch. He was taken by surprise. The man who was known for his lightning-fast draw did not even have time to reach for his gun. He was marched out into the cold night, along with his 2 deputies, Buck Stinson and Ned Ray. As the reality of his situation set in, the composure of the gentleman sheriff began to crumble. He pleaded for his life. He offered to leave the territory and never return. He begged for time to pray. He begged to see his sister-in-law. It was a pathetic display from a man who had ordered the deaths of so many without mercy. The vigilantes listened in silence. They were not moved by his tears. They knew that the men he had killed had also begged for their lives. They led him to the gallows, which, ironically, was a structure that Plummer himself had ordered to be built. Stinson and Ray went to their deaths cursing and fighting, but Plummer, after realizing that his pleas were futile, eventually fell silent. He looked at the men surrounding him, men who had once been his friends and supporters. He gave his revolver to a bystander and asked for a good drop. The rope was placed around his neck. The silver star was likely still in his possession, a tarnished symbol of his failure. When the command was given, Henry Plummer fell into the darkness. The architect of the innocents was dead. His body was left hanging in the freezing wind, a grim warning to anyone who would dare to cross the line between law and lawlessness. The morning after the hangings, the town of Bannack woke up to a strange new atmosphere. The fear that had hung over the valley like a fog had lifted, but it was replaced by a solemn quiet. The violence of the vigilantes had been necessary, but it was also traumatic. Good men had been forced to do terrible things. They had become executioners to save their community. The bodies of the sheriff and his deputies were cut down and buried in shallow graves on a hill overlooking the town. There were no eulogies and no headstones. They were simply put into the earth and forgotten. The vigilantes did not disband immediately. They remained active, ensuring that the remnants of the gang did not regroup. They posted warnings in the camps and on the trails. The sight of the mysterious numbers 3777 painted on a tent or a cabin door was enough to send shivers down the spine of any man with a guilty conscience. The crime rate in the territory dropped to almost zero. A man could once again walk the road with a bag of gold dust and fear nothing but the weather. The message had been received. The innocents were gone, and the guilty had paid the price. However, the legacy of the vigilantes is a complicated one. They brought order to chaos, but they did so by bypassing the very legal system they sought to establish. They proved that in the absence of law, the people have the right to defend themselves, but they also showed how thin the line is between justice and vengeance.
The story of the Montana vigilantes is not a story of heroes in white hats. It is a story of desperate men in a desperate time who did what they believed was necessary to survive. The ropes that swung in the winter of 1864 cast a long shadow that still stretches across the history of the West. The era of the vigilantes marked the end of the wild innocence of the mining camps. Bannack began to change. The raw energy of the gold rush gave way to a more structured society. Courts were established, and legitimate judges were appointed, and jails were built that were meant to hold prisoners rather than release them. But the memory of that winter remained. The story was told in hushed tones around campfires for generations. It was the story of the time when the miners took back their town. It was the story of the time when the only law in Montana was the law of the knot.